Capitalism can never stay home. It goes abroad. The ordinary people simply paid the cost of empire.
In a previous episode, we had mentioned that residential schools have been used by colonialists as a method of cultural genocide, removing children from their families and stripping them of their identities, languages, and practices. These were indeed also implemented in South Africa, particularly as part of broader colonial and apartheid policies aimed at assimilating or controlling indigenous populations. These schools were similar in some respects to the residential school systems seen in Canada and Australia, though they had unique characteristics shaped by South Africa's specific context. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, Christian missionaries established schools for indigenous African children. Many of these were boarding schools, where children were separated from their families and communities. The primary goal was often to convert them to Christianity and instill European cultural values, while providing basic education. Like residential schools in other countries, these institutions aimed to erase indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions, replacing them with European norms. This was part of a broader colonial strategy to control and, quote, civilize indigenous populations. Under apartheid, the South African government formalized racial segregation and implemented the Bantu Education Act of 1953. This act aimed to provide separate and inferior education for black South Africans, training them for menial labor and reinforcing their subjugation. While not all Bantu education schools were residential, some boarding schools were established, particularly in rural areas, to further isolate children from their cultural roots. The legacy of these schools includes the erosion of indigenous languages, cultures, and identities, as well as intergenerational trauma. Many former students have spoken about the harsh conditions, abuse, and psychological harm they experienced in these institutions. While South Africa's residential schools shared similarities with those in Canada and Australia, they were not part of a centralized system like the Canadian Indian residential schools. Instead, they were often run by religious organizations or the apartheid government, with varying degrees of oversight and brutality. So that's also just a forewarning, like if people think the education system can't get worse, more privatized, like that is what can happen. Like when I say that colonialism comes home, like you can watch your school systems degrade to the point where they are privatized, left to the churches, and then segregated to the point where students of color are given the most menial education to just become factory workers. And that will be like the company town schools for Amazon.
Yeah. I mean, that's the pattern, isn't it? You have a public sector, ruined and demonetized or defunded, over time. It gets worse and worse and worse. And so the only logical solution, quote unquote, is to privatize it so that companies can come in and pour capital into it.
Surely the service can't get worse when we privatize it.
No, we're going to revitalize it.
Yeah. You're talking about the mission schools, right? In South Africa?
Mm-hmm.
So how in Canada they found a bunch of like bodies of like indigenous kids that were put into their like mission schools. In Australia, we have the entire stolen generation of Aboriginal people who were taken from their parents,
right.
Forcibly taken from their parents. And keep in mind, right, the stolen generation in Australia, there are still people in the stolen generation who are alive today, right?
Yeah,
it's crazy.
They were taken from their families, from their community, and they were put in these schools where they were abused. They had their culture erased. They weren't allowed to speak their own language. A lot of them died as well from the abuse. And there's these massive, massive, long-lasting legacy from the stolen generation.
Yeah.
It's, again, when we're talking about patterns, this just plays out the same everywhere. In South Africa as well. Looks like they've done the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the Canadian residential schools operated up until the 90s in a lot of places. And that's why...
The 90s?
Yeah, because I listen to a lot of podcasts. Like I think Red Nation has talked about it quite a bit. Indigenous podcasts have been saying that a lot of those residential schools were operating up until very, very recently and with very little accountability. And it wasn't until like the Truth and Reconciliation Acts that a lot of the stuff had been revealed. But again, like that's why we're going so far back and talking about something like South Africa, because we want to talk about the context of it and talk about how this apartheid system that didn't end until 1994 went all the way back until 300 years prior when they just started imposing their will on these native people. In the previous episode, we had talked about the Soweto uprising and we talked about the Sharpeville massacre. But before we get into things like the township revolt, I want to talk a bit more about Umkhonto Wesizwe. So returning to Umkhonto Wesizwe, in the 1970s and the 80s, MK intensified its operations, including guerrilla warfare and targeted attacks on police stations, military installations, and apartheid officials. The 1980s in particular saw an increase in urban guerrilla tactics, including car bombs and attacks on symbols of apartheid, such as the 1983 bombing of the South African Air Force headquarters in Pretoria. Remember in the previous episode we had talked about the day, it was like Dingane Day, and they had done at least 57 bombings in that one day.
Oh, yeah.
Other notable attacks include, but are not limited to, the Sasol oil refinery sabotage in June 1980, causing damage estimated at 58 million rands.
Awesome.
A rocket attack on the Voortrekkerhout military base in August 1981, sabotage of the Coburg nuclear power plant in 1982, a car bomb explosion outside the South African Air Force headquarters in Church Street, Pretoria on May 20th, 1983, which killed 19 people and injured over 200. Numerous attacks on police stations, including those in Booysens, Moroka, and Orlando. Sabotage operations against economic and military installations, including power plants and railway lines, as we mentioned last time. And engaging South African Defence Force, the SADF, and South African Police, the SAP, personnel in various skirmishes. And these activities marked a shift in MK's strategy from primarily symbolic operations to a more aggressive approach, with the organization stating that civilians might be caught in the crossfire of other operations. And as we had made a point to discuss in the last episode, they had previously chosen sabotage because it would avoid innocent casualties, so this is a significant shift in their tactics.
Hell yeah.
It seems like it's more unfortunate, right? It doesn't seem like it's something that they want to do, they're just saying like, it's gotten to this point, like.
We also said earlier that they took every route that they could possibly to avoid civilian casualties, but they're aware that civilians will be killed. Unfortunately, that's just how it goes.
Yeah.
Like when you do a violent uprising, people are going to get caught in the crossfire. But there's no escape from violence like that. There's just no escape.
That's just reality.
And of course, they're labeled terrorists, and they literally are terrorists at this point, but also they were being called terrorists when they were doing peaceful things. So it's like, what is the incentive to not do the more terroristic things if you're already being called a terrorist when you're doing the non-terrorist things?
And they're already being met with brutality from the state
arrest,
when
exile.
they're being arrests and exile, and a lot of them being killings and deaths as well. And that was when they were peacefully protesting. So it's like, remember the standard, there's a statement that I really like. I think Hassan Piker repeats it a lot, but I don't know who he quotes it from, but it's like the standard of violence is set by the colonizer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So getting back to MK. So like I said, you'll remember Nelson Mandela was the first commander of MK, but he was arrested in 1962 and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964 during the Rivonia trial. Other leaders like Joe Slovo, Chris Hani, and Oliver Tambo led the organization from exile after the ANC was banned in South Africa. When the party was banned, MK operated largely from exile, with training camps established in countries like Angola, Tanzania, and Zambia. The organization received support from various African nations, the Soviet Union, and other socialist countries, which provided training, weapons, and funding. Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
MK's operations sometimes resulted in civilian casualties, leading to criticism from both within and outside South Africa. Of course, the apartheid regime labeled MK a terrorist organization, and its members faced severe repression, including imprisonment, torture, and execution. But as apartheid began to crumble in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the ANC and MK shifted their focus to negotiations for a democratic South Africa. Many former MK members, including Mandela and Chris Hani, became prominent leaders in post-apartheid South Africa, which also again shows their reluctance to having been terrorists, because once they stopped needing to be, once they started to see some successes in the crumbling of the apartheid system, they resorted to more diplomatic, political routes. Again, I'll mention it towards the end of the series, but Chris Hani, in the Dave Matthews song, when they do the live version of the song Every Day, they do a refrain, they say, "Honey, honey, come and dance with me." And most, I think, audience members think he's just saying honey, honey, but it's specifically a reference to Chris Hani.
That's really cool. I didn't know that.
So MK was officially disbanded in 1993, and its members were integrated into the South African National Defence Forces, the SANDF, after the first democratic elections in 1994. Umkhonto Wesizwe is remembered as a key force in the struggle against apartheid, symbolizing the resilience and determination of those who fought for freedom and equality. But let's return to the 1980s and the Township Revolt. So the Township Revolt, also known as the Val Uprising from 1984 to 86, was a period of popular revolt in black townships beginning in the Val Triangle on September 3, 1984. Driven by both local grievances and opposition to apartheid, the uprising affected most regions of the country. The government of P.W. Botha did not succeed in curbing the violence until after it imposed a national state of emergency in June 1986. The uprising is named for the place it began, the black townships of the Val Triangle, an industrial area of about 45 miles south of Johannesburg in Transvaal's PWV region. In this region, the Val Civic Association, the VCA, and other local activists held a series of meetings in August 1984 about proposed rent increases. On September 2nd, they resolved that residents should protest the increases by refusing to pay them and by staying away, both from school and from work, the following day. So on September 3rd, protesters marched through several Val townships in considerable numbers, delivering their demands to the Orange Val Development Board. In at least 3 of those townships, Sharpeville, Sebokeng, and Evaton, the marches turned at an indeterminate point into riots. There were also reports of violence in the Boipatong in Vaal, Tembisa on the East Rand, and Mamelodi north of Pretoria. In these areas, a number of buildings were set on fire, police were attacked with petrol bombs and bricks, roads were barricaded, and a stretch of the Golden Highway was closed by police after protesters stoned cars. 6 buses were set alight, and the deputy mayor of Sharpeville, Jacob Dlamini, was hacked to death in the street and then returned to his car, which was set on fire. Wow.
Does that sound familiar?
It's brutal.
Yep.
The precise impetus for the violence is unclear. Francisco Ruidi argues that at least some of the violence was partly premeditated, although the Val Civic Association intended the marches to be peaceful. There were other more militant groupings who were not committed to nonviolence. She suggests that other acts of violence, including the killing of Dlamini and other black councillors, were, quote, spontaneous and resulted from hostile interactions between crowds, police, and councillors. The South African police responded initially with tear gas and rubber bullets, and then began using live ammunition. Heavily armed reinforcements were brought in and continued to battle protesters overnight. The government reported 14 fatalities, including some as a result of police, quote, countermeasures. The following morning, as rioting continued in Sharpeville, Sebokeng, and Evaton, figures were revised upwards to 29 fatalities and an estimated 300 injuries, including at least a handful of injured policemen. It was therefore the bloodiest day of protest in South Africa since the 1976 Soweto uprising. In 1976, however, the police had unambiguously been responsible for the overwhelming majority of deaths. In Vaal, it was clear that the deaths had been caused by protesters as well as by police, though it was not clear in what proportions. Ruidi calculates that protesters killed 4 councillors and that the rest of the victims were shot by police.
Shocker.
Yeah. The protests of September 3rd turned into a popular uprising across several regions of the country, with many further deaths, 40 by the end of the first week. The unrest spread to Soweto, the country's largest township, the next week. Many of the civic and student organizations which drove the protests, among them the Congress of South African Students, were formally or informally aligned to the Union Democratic Front, or UDF, which in turn was aligned to the Exiled African National Congress, or ANC. Although there remains debate about the extent to which the UDF and ANC provided the organizational and strategic impetus for the uprising, their anti-apartheid ideology and symbols were given prominent place. In February 1989, F.W. de Klerk replaced P.W. Botha as state president of South Africa, marking a departure from the hardline approach favored by Botha. The next year, in February 1990, de Klerk met with Nelson Mandela, demonstrating his commitment to reform and negotiation, rather than confrontation and repression. Public facilities, including sports and recreational areas, are desegregated, and many ANC activists, including political prisoners, are freed from detention, signaling a move towards political liberalization. Now, most contemporary journalism is content to look back on this conclusion to apartheid and the related Namibian independence as a series of policies, simply bills that were drafted due to increasing, quote, pressure from the people while the government grew more liberal and friendly to pluralism. But there was a very militant and prolonged struggle that went along with this. So in 1990, the ANC was unbanned and Mandela was released after 27 years in prison. The country of Namibia also became independent this same year. So a side note on Namibia and the Border War, also known as the Namibian War of Independence, and sometimes denoted in South Africa as the Angolan Bush War, was a largely asymmetric conflict in Namibia, Zambia, and Angola from August 26, 1966 to March 21, 1990. So this went on for a very long time. It was fought between the South African Defence Force, the SADF, and the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, the PLAN, an armed wing of the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO. The South African Border War was closely intertwined with the Angolan Civil War. Following several years of unsuccessful petitioning through the United Nations and the International Court of Justice for Namibian independence from South Africa, SWAPO formed the PLAN in 1962. So again, they tried the peaceful diplomatic route. With material assistance from the Soviet Union, China, and sympathetic African states such as Tanzania, Ghana, and Algeria. Hell yeah. You love to see it. Fighting broke out between the PLAN and the South African Security Forces in August 1966. Between 1975 and 1988, the SADF staged massive conventional raids into Angola and Zambia to eliminate PLAN's forward operating bases. It also deployed specialist counterinsurgency units such as the Covoet and 32 Battalion, trained to carry out external reconnaissance and track guerrilla movements. South African tactics became increasingly aggressive as the conflict progressed. The SADF's incursions produced Angolan casualties and occasionally resulted in severe collateral damage to economic installations regarded as vital to the Angolan economy. Ostensibly to stop these raids, but also to disrupt the growing alliance between the SADF and the National Union for the Total Independence for Angola, UNITA, which the former was arming with the captured PLAN equipment, the Soviet Union backed the People's Armed Forces of Liberation of Angola, FAPLA, through a large contingent of military advisors, along with up to $4 billion worth of modern defense technology in the 1980s. Hell yeah, dude. That's cool.
Crazy.
Beginning in 1984, regular Angolan units under Soviet command were confident enough to confront the SADF. Their positions were also bolstered by thousands of Cuban troops. The state of war between South Africa and Angola briefly ended with the short-lived Lusaka Accords, but resumed in August 1985 as both PLAN and UNITA took advantage of the ceasefire to intensify their own guerrilla activity, leading to a renewed phase of FAPLA combat operations culminating in the Battle of Cuito Carnaval. The South African border war was virtually ended by the Tripartite Accord, mediated by the United States, which committed to a withdrawal of Cuban and South African military personnel from Angola and Southwest Africa, respectively. PLAN launched its final guerrilla campaign in April 1989. Southwest Africa received formal independence as the Republic of Namibia a year later, on March 21, 1990. Despite being largely fought in neighboring states, the South African border war had a phenomenal cultural and political impact on South African society. The country's apartheid government devoted considerable effort towards presenting the war as part of a containment program against regional Soviet expansionism, and used it to stoke public anti-communist sentiment. Does that sound familiar? It remains an integral theme in contemporary South African literature at large, and Afrikaans language works in particular, having given rise to a unique genre known as Grensliterature, directly translated to border literature. In the Namibian context, it is also commonly referred to as the Namibian War of Independence. However, these terms have been criticized for ignoring the wider regional implications of the war, and the fact that PLAN was based in, and did most of its fighting from, countries other than Namibia. And now we return to the struggle of apartheid and the beginning of its unraveling. And we had spent some time talking about Umkhonto we Sizwe, but we'll talk about them in more detail. So regarding Umkhonto we Sizwe's tactics and escalation in the interests of ending apartheid, this is part of the Umkhonto we Sizwe or MK operations report from NelsonMandela.org. Much of this is leaders and representatives of MK speaking about the struggle themselves. The objective of the armed struggle. Quote, "The time comes in the life of any nation when there remains only two choices, submit or fight. That time has now come to South Africa. We shall not submit, and we have no choice but to hit back by all means within our power, in defense of our people, our future, and our freedom." This is from the MK Manifesto in 1961. It's powerful shit. I love that. It's like if the 14 words were good and like based in actual moral right.
Right.
Not racism. The objective of the armed struggle was the overthrow of the apartheid state in order to achieve democracy, freedom, and peace in South Africa. The ANC's decision to embark on armed struggle was reached after many decades of nonviolent resistance, which was met by increasingly brutal repression by the apartheid regime. The African National Congress, ANC, had no choice but to resort to armed struggle after the National Party government first narrowed the arena of legal political activity and finally closed it in 1960 by banning the movement. The ANC asserted moral legitimacy for the resort to violence on the grounds of necessary defense and just war. Further, Umkhonto we Sizwe was a means to channel the revolutionary violence the oppressed were calling for, especially after the Sharpeville massacre. Quote, "Spontaneous actions of the people result from government provocation. The people's patience becomes exhausted, and the masses become desperate in the absence of a strong militant organization. In these circumstances, people are likely to resort more and more into senseless, dangerous forms of action. If we embark on unplanned and misguided political actions, we are playing into the hands of the enemy." This is from the ANC National Executive Committee Statement, 1963.
They're literally talking about, hey, fucking stop doing adventurism, basically.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We can relate back to Luigi Mangione, not to besmirch my favorite Italian man, but like, adventurism, it's not particularly effective. And look, we have an example of a real revolutionary movement in Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid movement, the ANC, and he's basically saying, look, so if we're going to do violence, there's a way to do it and there's a way not to do it. You don't do adventurism because it just plays into their hands. They use it as a justification to pass new laws that crack down on us. If you're going to do violence, you do it in such a way that it's overwhelming and you win, and you're the one who writes the laws.
Right.
That's how you do it. You don't have like random, disparate acts of violence that give the state justification to crack down on you even more than they already have.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. From the very beginning, the ANC emphasized that armed resistance took place within political context and was one of a number of interrelated methods of struggle. Cadres had to fully understand the basic policy positions of the ANC, the first step in military training. They were at all times guided by and subordinate to the political leadership of the ANC. And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of the party form and the discipline in sticking to it during the struggle, and how differently things would have gone had this not been the case.
100%.
Cadres were taught to maintain the moral high ground occupied by the liberation movement, owing to the justness of our cause in the actual theater of battle. This meant that the choice of targets, attitude toward civilians, and treatment of captives had to reflect the ANC's policies. The forms of armed struggle adopted by the ANC and MK were intended to achieve the goals of the movement with the least loss of life. In essence, the armed struggle was waged to bring peace to South Africa, to stop the apartheid regime as quickly and as effectively as possible in order to prevent the conflict in the country degenerating into racial civil war.
It's almost like a Maoism, you know?
They're
They
so
just
good, it's like
take
they're
that.
so principled.
Yeah, it's really good.
So the MK training and training camps. Few liberation movements have had to wage armed struggle under such complex, difficult, and harsh conditions. In the early years, South Africa was surrounded by countries hostile to the idea of liberation, particularly Rhodesia and the former Portuguese colonies. There were no friendly bases on the borders of our country, which made infiltration into South Africa difficult and dangerous. Cadres spent many lonely years in the camps, long after they had completed their training because of this difficulty. At times, there was a scarcity of food and clothing, a lack of medicines and health facilities. In this regard, the role of the commissariat became crucial. In all camps, there was a commissariat responsible for the political education, general welfare, and cultural well-being of cadres. Serious attention was given to the general education of cadres. Special literacy classes and bridging courses were designed. So successful were these courses that many who completed them were able to enroll in formal education institutions in countries such as Angola, Zambia, Tanzania, and Uganda. In a center outside Luanda called the Technical Training Center, formal education was given in mechanics and auto electrics. Driving lessons were also available. The ANC also ran a huge center called the Self-Help Medical Center, where courses in nursing, advanced motor mechanics, building, and carpentry were offered. Hundreds of cadres trained in these centers became professionals.
That's really cool.
It's great, like they were also educating all their members.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth noting that the idea of a commissariat or having commissars, political officers, that's borrowed directly from the Soviet Union. That's
Mhm.
another of the examples of the ANC adopting Soviet methodologies.
Well, they were working
Westoids-
directly with them. They were getting direct help from them. And like, it's because they were proving themselves worthy of getting that material help and that education.
Mm.
Whereas like, if the Americans were to try to present like their communist party, like the ACP went to China and said, hey, you want to help us start a revolution? They'd be like, get the fuck out of here. You don't have an organization worth giving weapons or money or anything to, because it would only put us at risk and make us look bad.
Mm-hmm.
But people have this idea of what commissars are in Western countries. I think they stood behind the lines with a machine gun and they would shoot retreating soldiers and stuff like that. Which is
Hilarious.
just anti-Soviet bullshit, basically. But commissars were important. They were put in Red Army units, and their job is it's like education. They educate people. They're not there to fucking shoot people. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you realize it's just your army needs to be. You have to have a means of like ideologically training your soldiers to believe in the cause that they're in and to maintain that belief. And you can only do that through education. And this is across
Or propaganda,
the
in the US's case.
Yeah.
yeah, so the US goes through a different route to do that, and it's their massive and sophisticated propaganda machine. Whereas the Soviets were like, well, what we'll do is we'll have educated political officers who communicate directly with the troops.
Mhm.
So
It's a good alternative.
there's nothing wrong with commissars.
There's also
Yeah.
nothing wrong with re-education when you have like a severely indoctrinated populace too, but that's another tale. So back to South Africa. There were 2 centers in Angola, Kela and Kamalundi, for training cadres in agriculture and the production of food for the army. Production was very successful, especially in the early 1980s. We were able to supply most of the camps. Our camps were beehives of cultural activities. There was a network of committees to promote music, drama, literature, etc. In all camp programs, cultural activity was compulsory. Many excellent choirs, drama, and musical groups were formed. Many poets emerged from our camps who continue to produce magnificent work to this day. Perhaps the highest achievement in this regard was the formation of the cultural ensemble known as the Amandla Group. It was supported and nurtured by great South African artists such as Jonas Gwangwa, Dennis DePaule, Abdullah Ibrahim, Letta Mabuli, and others. The group became internationally renowned, staging successful tours in Southern Africa and Europe. Military training courses were designed to produce a cadre with a broad range of skills, well equipped to execute the various tasks of the liberation struggle. Lectures were conducted on political science and the art of warfare. The following military subjects were taught in the camps: military topography, engineering and tactics, physical training, march and drill, firearms, artillery, political education, first aid, anti-air weaponry, military combat work, i.e. underground or clandestine methods of organization, and methods of planning insurrection. Courses ran for 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or longer depending on the mission or tasks for which the individual or unit was being prepared. So this is like real serious education into like guerrilla warfare and tactics, and it's like all
We
encompassing.
fucking need that. We fucking need that, dude.
But also like the fact that I have repeatedly said that there are no leftist orgs in the West in any country that exist that do anything close to this, and I have been nothing but shouted down, called names, and just like, okay, I mean, we can pretend that these exist somewhere and that maybe these orgs are doing stuff like this, but I feel like we would have all heard of it. Like it would have made headlines if one of them got busted at some point, but like this literally does not exist. But this is what real Marxist organizing looks like. This is what real revolutionary praxis is.
Yep. People just want to, in the West, they just want to come together and sing Kumbaya, and it's really sad in comparison
about
to
it,
this.
not like just write them off and do the hippie thing, but I feel like they genuinely believe if they just get together, build enough community, do enough donations and mutual aid and protests and stuff, that will then lead to the next thing. But to again bring it back to a joke, it is like the underpants gnomes. It's like mutual aid and protests, question mark, revolution. And it does not work that way. Like you have to be guided and principled in this.
Yep, 100%.
Over the years, thousands of cadres were produced, among them commanders, commissars, instructors, and specialists in various military fields. Some would remain to staff the camps and continue to train other cadres. Many infiltrated the country for various tasks, yet others joined the diplomatic corps to run the many external missions of the liberation movement. Today, many of these cadres are to be found among the leadership of the Alliance. Some are ambassadors and officials in foreign missions, others are ministers, members of parliament, in the civil service and the private sector. Others served many years of imprisonment or gave their lives for the liberation of this country. And now we'll get into Section 4, MK operations in the context of the major phases of the liberation struggle. The first MK actions in 1960 were sabotage operations, and cadres were under strict instructions to avoid all loss of life. Targets included government installations, police stations, electric pylons, pass offices, and other symbols of apartheid rule. In rural areas, there were arson attacks on sugarcane fields and wattle estates. And wattle is like a plant that they were farming down South Africa. The sabotage campaign failed in its objective of convincing the apartheid regime to engage in negotiations in a national convention. By the time of the Rivonia arrests, MK leaders were discussing the possibility of embarking on guerrilla warfare to take the struggle forward. The draft document Operation Mayabuye indicated aspects of the thinking of the leadership at this time, and identified targets as follows: strategic road, railways, and other communications, power stations, police stations, camps and military forces, and irredeemable government stooges. Like that last one. In the years following the Rivonia arrests, the ANC built up a force in some of the liberated countries in Africa. It was decided to launch a joint campaign, later known as the Wankie Campaign, unfortunately named that one, but later known as the Wankie Campaign, with ZIPRA, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, in Zimbabwe in 1967 and 68. This operation was aimed at infiltrating trained MK operatives into South Africa in line with the concept of rural-based guerrilla warfare. However, some of the operatives were forced to move into Botswana and others had to withdraw to Zambia after considerable difficulties were encountered, particularly the lack of bases among the population. A group of cadres, including Chris Hani, were captured in Botswana and served prison sentences there. Following the Wankie campaign, the ANC held a watershed consultative conference at Morogoro in 1969 to discuss ways of taking the struggle forward. This conference set out a new program, Strategy and Tactics of the ANC. This was the first comprehensive set of strategic guidelines for the ANC in the period of armed struggle. A decision was made to shift the ANC's approach from sending armed groups of cadres into the country to spark off guerrilla warfare, and instead emphasize that a period of political reconstruction inside the country was necessary, since the successful development of armed struggle depended on political mobilization and strong underground structures, an important precursor to the theories of People's War developed in the early 1980s. So they needed a base of people to move among.
Yep. People's War.
Military struggle was seen as forming only part of and being guided by a broader political strategy to ensure that the battle against apartheid was fought on all possible fronts, involving not just an army, but all those oppressed by apartheid. Quote, "When we talk of revolutionary armed struggle, we are talking of political struggle by means which include the use of military force. It is important to emphasize this because our movement must reject all manifestations of militarism which separates armed people's struggle from its political context." This is from Strategy and Tactics. Guerrilla warfare is typically carried out by a small and militarily weak organization, poorly armed but highly mobile, against a highly organized conventional force which has all the resources of the state behind it. From the outset, MK aimed to limit the loss of civilian lives and constantly targeted the military and police, who formed the front line of defense of the apartheid state. Classic guerrilla warfare roots itself among the rural population and moves from there into the urban areas. It is dependent on the availability of suitable terrain, such as inaccessible mountains or forests where base camps can be established. In contrast, MK's tactics had to take into account the relatively unfavorable terrain in South Africa. A multifaceted approach was adopted, with guerrilla operations carried out throughout the country in both rural and urban areas, targeting the center pillars on which the apartheid state rested: military targets and political state infrastructure. This basic approach did not change over the years, even under extreme provocation. However, by the early 1980s, it was accepted that in the context of intensified confrontation between the apartheid regime and forces for democratic change, the fear of civilians being caught in the crossfire could no longer be a decisive factor in avoiding certain armed operations directed against the personnel and infrastructure of the apartheid state. So it seems like it's just an unfortunate conclusion that they came to after an intense, decades-long struggle along principled lines, having tried the diplomatic methods, having tried armed struggle, using only sabotage and being very careful to avoid civilian loss of life. Now they realized they just had to go even further. They had to continue escalating.
Yeah.
And then we get to the Soweto uprising, which we also had discussed before. The 1976 uprising and subsequent massacres and other atrocities by the security forces gave new impetus to the struggle. Thousands of new recruits flooded into MK, bringing with them a fresh will to fight the enemy, born of their own bitter experience in fighting a brutal enemy only with stones. New vistas opened to intensify the struggle and to hit back in defense of the people. The key challenge was to channel this youthful and impatient militancy into military and political struggle within ANC policy guidelines. The ANC had the responsibility to educate these youths to understand that the enemy was in fact the system of apartheid itself, not white individuals. It is a remarkable achievement on the part of the ANC that we succeeded in doing this. Many of these youths, after initial training in MK camps and in Eastern Europe, were briefed and infiltrated back into the country to begin operations. Between 1976 and 1979, there was a marked escalation of armed actions. About 37 armed actions took place between June 1976 and the end of 1978. Railway lines were sabotaged, police stations attacked, and Bantu administration offices were bombed. The battle was slowly but surely being taken to the enemy, and MK had moved from concentrating purely on sabotage operations to the first stages of guerrilla war.
It's really good that they educate their soldiers and militants that the enemy is the system of apartheid, not like white people themselves, which is a very Marxist strategy. You're talking about systems rather than making it a racialized, or your solution is racialized. Because otherwise you would just have indiscriminate acts of violence against random white people, and that's not going to help their cause necessarily.
Yeah, it makes it look worse. It also gives fuel to your enemies who say that you're just waging some kind of racist war or engaging in terrorism or just being indiscriminate.
Yep.
It's also, I think, why people like that movie V for Vendetta so much, because while it's like an individualist, liberal kind of movie, the targets were legitimate because he went after legitimate targets every time and then made them symbolic. in the way that only a fantasy movie could do, it wins people over. So at least gets that principle correct.
Yeah.
Getting into the guerrilla warfare and People's War from 1970 to 1990. As we stated in our main submission to the Truth Commission, the Watershed 1978 Politico-Military Commission's report, also known as the Green Book, again stressed the central importance of political mobilization. Quote, "The armed struggle must be based on and grow out of mass political support, and it must eventually involve all our people. All military activities must at every stage be guided by and determined by the need to generate political mobilization, organization, and resistance, with the aim of progressively weakening the enemy's grip on his reins of political, economic, social, and military power by a combination of political and military action." In line with this approach, the Revolutionary Council, formed in 1969 and chaired by Oliver Tambo, was reorganized to reinforce the supremacy of political leadership. It was also intended to ensure that the task of mass mobilization and underground organization received the necessary emphasis to reinforce the links between the armed struggle, the mass base, and the underground structures of the ANC. A central operational MK headquarters was established by Joe Modiza and Joe Slovo. After several years in which there had been no MK actions inside the country following the impetus of the Soweto uprising, units were sent into the country in 1978 to carry out attacks on police stations. This is going to be known as the G5 operation. The stations attacked included Moroka, Orlando, and Buisens. The following year, in 1979, ANC President Tambo asked the NEC for a mandate to form a special unit to attack key strategic targets, spectacular operations that would hit the economy hard and inspire the oppressed majority. The unit would report directly to him. He would authorize such attacks and take political responsibility for them. This was agreed to, and the first Special Operations Command consisted of Joe Slovo, Manso Magabudi, and Abu Bakr Ismail. As with other MK units, targets were carefully selected in accordance with the political aims and policies of the movement, and planning for operations was as careful as possible. Whenever possible, a final reconnaissance was undertaken just before an attack to ensure that conditions had not changed. This was to ensure we minimized the loss of civilian life. A further aspect of all planning was to ensure that cadres had planned for their safe withdrawal after attacks, and had the necessary resources to do so. Initially, the targets were limited to oil refineries, fuel depots, the Coburg nuclear plant, and military targets such as the Voortrekkerhout. That thing again. With the increasingly indiscriminate attacks on neighboring states and the viciousness of attacks on South African civilians by the security forces, it was decided by Special Operations Command to attack military personnel. This resulted in operations such as the car bomb at South African Air Force HQ in Pretoria. The case studies presented will indicate that such operations were not carried out on the spur of the moment or on the whim of a particular individual, but were based on months of careful preparations. There was a steady increase in the number of operations carried out by other MK units from Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, and in later years, Zimbabwe. One study estimated that 150 cases of armed action took place between 1976 and 1982, overwhelmingly concentrated on economic targets, the administrative machinery of apartheid, SAP and SADF installations, and personnel. In mid-1983, MHQ produced a discussion document, Planning for People's War, which posed the question as to whether the time was ripe to move away from the 1979 approach towards People's War, defined as war in which a liberation army becomes rooted among the people who progressively participate actively in the armed struggle both politically and militarily, including the possibility of engaging in partial or general uprising. Among the conclusions were that the ANC should continue carrying out and even escalating those actions, which had played an important role in stimulating political activity, mass resistance, and mass organization, but that there should be more concentration on destroying enemy personnel, military, and police. This document noted that the policy of arming the people cannot mean that we begin now to distribute arms to whosoever wishes to receive them among the oppressed. In the first place, we had neither the capacity nor the means to do this on any meaningful scale. In the second place, it would be completely wrong to engage in a policy of merely distributing weaponry to people, trusting to luck that they will use them on the side of the revolution. Also very familiar, sounding very relevant to modern day struggles either in Ukraine or Gaza, anywhere you can think of. The people who are principled do not just dole out firearms willy-nilly with no qualifications, whereas that's what they did in Ukraine, and we've heard all kinds of horror stories about how they're getting into the hands of some really awful terrorists, like the worst kinds of people.
Yep. Ukraine is so fucked, man.
No, I think it's going to be great. They're going to be fine.
Yeah.
I honestly just want the war to end. It's just such a fucking horrendous waste of human life. It's
Absolutely.
like World War One, where it's like just this pointless fucking inter-imperialist proxy war, basically.
Yeah. Kind of like a 19th century annexation almost.
Mm.
You know, it's just like, why?
Let's see.
Anyways.
This document reflected the debates that were taking place all the time in the ranks of the liberation movement on how to respond to new situations as they emerged. The essence of these debates was around the restraint of the ANC in the face of the enemy's brutality, whether we should not adopt the easy route and allow less discriminate control over the usage of weapons and choice of targets. At each stage of struggle, people on the ground would respond with anger to repression, and themselves start to take initiatives which would not strictly accord with the strategy and tactics of the ANC. So again, they had the opposite problem of the West. They had too many people willing to engage in direct action, violence, adventurism, and they couldn't easily channel those people into political organizing, whereas in the West, we have too many people organizing on purely political lines and not willing to act.
Mm-hmm.
The constant challenge facing the ANC and MK was how to channel anger on the ground to ensure that the strategic perspective of a democratic and non-racial society is not sacrificed on the altar of quick fix, dramatic, and misguided actions. The tension between such intensification of struggle and the need to avoid a racial war that the MK manifesto eloquently expressed at the founding of the Liberation Army remained with the movement to the last day of armed struggle. In contrast to this highly disciplined and restrained approach to the use of violence, the South African regime committed atrocity after atrocity against civilian targets inside and outside the country, including supporting the war efforts of UNITA and RENAMO, and massive raids against what were portrayed as ANC targets in neighboring states such as Matola in 1991, the 1982 Masaru massacre, Gaborone in 1985, Lusaka in 1987, Harare and Bulawayo, to quote a few examples. Several of the casualties in these operations were nationals of the host countries. No distinction whatsoever was made between hard and soft targets, between MK operatives and unarmed refugees and civilians, including women and children. In an interview with Oliver Tambo, published in 1983 in The Guardian, the issue of civilian casualties was dealt with. Quote, "When we blew up the Sasol tanks, where thousands of people were working, the attack was carried out in such a way that no one was injured. Yet, on the other hand, our people were being captured, tortured, and mercilessly interrogated. We have fought back when attacked, and there have been many clashes with the police, but only the police. Lately, the regime has become almost desperate. There have been assassinations of our people. In 1979, they tried to kill hundreds of our people at a military school in Angola." Referring to the Matola raid, the Masaru raid, and the SAAF bombing of Maputo, Oliver Tambo added, quote, "This means the conflict is escalating. We always thought it was going to be a bitter, brutal, vicious struggle, almost as a necessary precondition for the liberation of South Africa. We have to go through that. The conflict is reaching new levels. There is to be much destruction, much suffering, and a lot of bloodshed, which will not be confined to South Africa. In 1980, we signed the Geneva Protocols and said that if we captured any enemy soldiers, we would treat them as prisoners of war. The fact is, we are not against civilians. We do not include them in our definition of the enemy. The ANC was nonviolent for a whole decade in the face of violence against African civilians. What do we mean by civilians? It really means white civilians. No one refers to Africans as civilians, and they have been victims of shootings all the time, even children. They have been killed in the hundreds. Yet the word has not been used in all these years. Now it is being used, especially after the Pretoria or SAAF HQ bomb. But implicit in the practice of the South African regime is that when you shoot an African, you are not killing a civilian. We don't want to kill civilians, but some will be hit, quite accidentally and regrettably. I am sure we are going to lose many civilians and many innocent people, as happens in any violent situation. We do not boast about it in the way the SA regime boasts about its killings. I think South Africa is going to be a very happy country one day, and we will avoid all avoidable loss of life. But, harsh though this sounds, we cannot allow the system to persist for the sake of saving a few lives. It is not so harsh when one considers how many lives apartheid has destroyed." Dead on, yeah.
Yeah.
All very principled and rational.
It's the moral calculus that you just have to hash out when you're trying to do a revolution.
So now we're into 1985 and the Kabwe Conference and controversies surrounding the issue of soft targets. The questions of ANC policy towards soft targets and taking the struggle to white areas arise in the context of the unprecedented, mass-based confrontation with the apartheid state, which was taking place at all levels of society within the country from the early 1980s onwards. Civics, community organizations, and trade unions were all engaged in intense struggles. MK operations increased sharply, most of them carried out by formal units based inside the country, many of which were supported and housed by underground political cells. The Kabwe Conference was held in June 1985 to assess developments since the Morogoro Conference of 1969. The day before it opened, Pretoria attacked several homes in Gaborone, Botswana, killing 12 people. 2 young female citizens of Botswana, who were blown to pieces, 1 Somalian, a 6-year-old child from Lesotho, and 8 South Africans, 5 of whom were members of the ANC, but none of them members of MK. All those killed were unarmed.
Jesus.
The conference reaffirmed ANC policy with regard to targets considered legitimate, but the risk of civilians being caught in the crossfire when such operations took place could no longer be allowed to prevent the urgently needed, all-round intensification of the armed struggle. The focus of armed operations had to shift towards striking directly at enemy personnel, and the struggle had to move out of the townships to the white areas. This was immediately seized on by the propaganda machinery of the apartheid regime, and falsely portrayed as a decision to begin indiscriminate killings of white civilians. Can you imagine them saying that? So dishonestly, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Oliver Tambo expressed the mood of the conference eloquently. It represented, he said, quote, "a turning point in the history of all the people of South Africa. Our conference itself will be remembered by our people as a council of war that planned the seizure of power by these masses, the penultimate convention that gave the order for us to take our country through the terrible but cleansing fires of revolutionary war to a condition of peace, democracy, and the fulfillment of our people who have already suffered far too much and far too long." I love this guy. He's so good.
Yeah, this guy's awesome.
At a press conference, he noted that in the preceding 9 to 10 months, many soft targets had been hit by the enemy. Nearly 500 civilians had been killed. The distinction between hard and soft targets is going to disappear in an intensified confrontation, in an escalating conflict. I am not saying that our conference used the word soft targets. I am saying that the conference recognized that we are in it. It is happening every day, he said. By the end of 1985, an official pamphlet titled "Take the Struggle to the White Areas," with an exclamation point, was distributed inside the country. Targets were identified as follows: the racist army, police, death squads, agents and stooges in our midst, and the call to take the war to the white areas is defined as follows: strengthening our workers' organizations and engaging in united action in the factories, mines, farms, and suburbs. Spreading the consumer boycott to all areas of the country. Organized and well-planned demonstrations in the white suburbs and central business districts. Forming underground units and combat groups in our places of work and taking such actions as sabotage in the factories, mines, farms, and suburbs, and disrupt the enemy's oil, energy, transport, communications, and other vital systems. Systematic attacks against the army and police and the so-called area defense units in the white areas, well-planned raids on the armories and dumps of the army, police, farmers, and so on to secure arms for our units, and the ANC leadership had called on all members and supporters of the ANC to intensify the struggle at all costs, to move towards creating a situation of ungovernability and people's war. So now this reminds me the other day of that post that I made, where I had taken someone's video from TikTok and they had talked about anarchist calisthenics. They were talking about something, it was like literally the baby version of this, and they were saying like, just start practicing disobedience in your everyday life. Just start breaking rules. Like if the cashier is like giving you a free thing, don't say anything. It's like, well, why would you anyway? Or like they were using the example of like a different coworker ratting out their coworker for giving something for free on the register or whatever. And it was all very like juvenile. It just seemed really immature and just liberal in its conception of how resistance works or how disobedience works on any kind of mass scale and how you start to build something like that. But this is what it really looks like. And when you see these people doing this, talking about it on this level, it really makes Westerners look like the children that they are when it comes to this political organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have a severely infantilized population, you know, in the West. And it just makes having a revolution and having these serious conversations about what needs to happen that much harder.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's brains are poisoned by Marvel movies. I hate to say it. I'm sorry, guys, but like,
No, you're totally.
a revolution doesn't look like the fucking Hunger Games. Sorry, you don't get on TV and go, President Snow, look at all this. He bombs hospitals. That doesn't work. Sorry.
Yeah.
You know what's funny is I haven't talked about it since my old show, like 4 years ago when we had first started it up. It was right around the time of the election, and then January 6th happened. And we laughed at it. Like we laughed at how silly it was and how juvenile it was, because even when they rushed the Capitol, even when they exercised some actual militant kind of force and they worked their way into a building by force and get to like the halls of Congress and stand at the podium and everything, what did they have? Nothing. They just screamed incoherently. They acted like a bunch of children. They smeared shit on the walls. They took stuff. They broke things. They acted like a bunch of anarchists. It's like that's what this country produces, because it is, like you said, Joseph, an infantilized populace of baby brains. Like they're dumb political brains. They don't get it.
Yeah. And they also, I was just listening to Matt Crispin talk about this actually. He was talking about the January 6th event and how the people that were doing that, they've been so taught their whole lives that actual politics happens because someone else is doing it. Like you're looking to a leader, you're looking to a group, you're looking to an authority. And even when these guys were in the halls of Congress, they were still looking towards somebody else to make the change happen for them. Like they had no fucking clue. They had no fucking clue what they were doing. It was ridiculous.
That was a moment. They really could have seized that moment and taken advantage of it and said, like, here are our policies going forward. And to have that kind of platform to people to do it and then just have nothing to say, it's a huge failing.
It's because they were all fucking it was a quote unquote revolution of boat dealership owners, basically.
the beautiful boaters.
Like grifters.
They didn't go there with any kind of revolutionary anything at all. There was no desire to have a fascist revolution. It's just like a bunch of idiot lumpenproll and petty bourgeois morons just having a little tantrum. I honestly believe that to a certain extent, the security state allowed January 6th to happen.
Just for the PR.
Just for the PR. Weirdly, how the police sort of backed off and let them in. It was very much like, I wonder if
almost like that allowed the police state to have a much bigger reaction in budget. And so it was convenient for them to have that happen.
I mean, look at how liberals acted hysterically after January 6th. Meanwhile, I remember me and all my friends, when we watched January 6th happening here, we were all laughing at it. And a lot of my friends are liberals and conservatives and stuff like that. And they were laughing at it too. They were like, this is not a overthrow of the government. This is this is American fucking hogs doing American hog stuff. This is
my liberal friends at the time were scared.
Yeah.
They were legit scared. They were like, oh my God, this is like really horrifying. I can't believe they got in and got that far. I'm like, let's see where this goes. This should be funny.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Most liberals here were fretting about it as well. But it's like anyone with a fucking brain looked at it and was just like, this is just
what
funny.
Are these guys doing?
But who even died from it? Like one person?
I don't even know anymore. Like I've seen so many stories about the people that like tased their balls, security guards who died of heart attacks or were killed by fire extinguishers or were stomped to death or whatever. All I know for sure is Ashley Babbitt. Rest in piss.
Someone tased their balls and died of a heart attack, and then
I hope. I'm gonna choose to believe it,
dude.
And then I think one person got shot by the police.
Yeah.
Was that Ashley Babbitt?
Yeah, that was her.
Yeah.
Legend.
And then Trump pardoned like all of the people, right?
They're all out now. Actually, we probably shouldn't talk shit on them because they can come find us now. They're all out.
Honestly,
shit with the cops. Like one of them got shot by a police deputy in Florida, like a week after getting out because he just can't be tamed, man. You can't tame me. I'm not listening to the law, man.
Yeah, I don't mind them getting pardoned because, like, what did they even do wrong, really? Like
trespassing,
they trespassed,
not where they're supposed to be.
They trespassed, and the only real acts of violence that happened were the police to them. I don't even think that the January 6 rioters were even fascists or anything like that. I think they were just a bunch of lumpenproll and petty bourgeois morons with no ideology other than like their, what's the term they use? Id? There's like raw.
Yeah. Yep.
I think that's the philosophical term. It's like raw.
I mean, the one guy literally looked like a caveman. So yeah.
Yeah. It's just raw stupidity. That's all it was. Anyway, everyone should watch the Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode about January 6th, where it turns out... No, it was just the 2020 episode season, whatever season came out in 2020 or 2021, where the final episode was like every single controversy that happened in 2020 was the gang, including they were at January 6th in support of Kanye West. Which is really pretty funny. They're like walking around and they're like, who the fuck are all these people? I thought this was for Kanye.
Yeah.
I fucking love that show. That's so good.
Oh, it's so good.
I'll read a few more paragraphs here. I'll probably read this page and then bookmark it.
All right.
But so in contrast with a conventional military force, in which planning takes place at an HQ level by experienced officers, in guerrilla warfare, most of the detailed planning takes place at the lowest level. Each cadre has to be trusted to make principled and educated decisions with regard to choice of target, whilst keeping a close eye on developments and feelings amongst the people in his or her community, a responsibility which no soldier in a conventional force ever has to face. There was no hotline to higher structures to ask for guidance. Communication could, and at times did, result in death, given the degree to which communication lines were monitored. Consequently, a great deal depended on the political maturity, general experience, and immediate situation in which each cadre operated. Cadres made decisions in the context of pressures they encountered on a day-to-day basis, in which enemy atrocities against civilians were mounting. Increasing numbers of attacks took place in urban areas, and civilians were increasingly caught in the crossfire. The period between 1985 and 1988 witnessed unprecedented violence, overwhelmingly directed at black civilians, as the regime fought to regain the strategic initiative it had lost. The behavior of the regime was a significant factor in provoking certain attacks which were in breach of policy. Anger on the ground was explosive. The atrocities committed by the apartheid regime demanded retaliation, and the careful response was at times met with angry contempt. In some cases, cadres responded to state brutality by hitting back in anger as soon as possible, as in the case of the Amanzimtoti bomb. A comment by Oliver Tambo in response to this attack is worth repeating. Quote, "Massacres have been perpetrated against civilians. Mamelodi, a massacre. Uitenhage, a massacre. Botswana, a massacre. Queenstown, a massacre. Certainly, we are beginning to see South Africans of all races burying their loved ones who have died in the South African situation. The whole of South Africa is beginning to bleed. If I had been approached by an ANC unit and asked whether they should go and plant a bomb at a supermarket, I would have said, of course not. But when our units are faced with what is happening all around them, it is understandable that some of them should say, well, I may have to face being disciplined, but I'm going to do this." So, you can see as the conflict escalates, both sides are starting to seemingly lose control of their forces on the ground level, and actions are being carried out which may not be as principled or even with the support of any of the organizers, but it's happening. And even in this case, when it's happening, the liberation forces, like the people who are literally labeled the terrorists, are being more principled and more considerate of human life than the state itself is being, the so-called legitimate state.
Yeah, it's the same pattern happening every single time. It's the same imperialist playbook, and then revolutionaries having to work with the material conditions that they're faced with.
Yeah.
That was good.
Yeah. I think we got through like half of the statements from the ANC and MK themselves. So I think that's really particularly interesting to read it from their perspective, hear them describe it from that point of view, but also just a lot of great info in there for people who want to see what like actual Marxist revolutionary organizing looks like.
Yeah, it really reminds me of reading through some of Mao Zedong's like first volume and his second volume, talking about like, this is what we are having to do on the ground, and this is how we are having to fight the Japanese. And it's very much just reminding me of that, you know? It's really, really interesting history.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, I'm going to end the recording there, and we'll end it for the night. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Appreciate it. It's fun one again.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yes.